In this video, I want to talk about an important skill when it comes to calculation in games. And for a lack of a better phrase, I typically refer to this one with my students as overcoming resistance. And this relates to the difference between calculating in your games and calculating in, let's say, an online puzzle. When you're solving a puzzle online, you, number one, typically know that there's going to be a solution there. And number two, there's no great penalty for getting it wrong. If you mess up a puzzle, you lose a couple of puzzle rating points and you just move on to the next one, no big deal. But when you mess up in a game, you might just lose the game on the spot, and that comes with the penalty of losing precious tournament rating points. So I've always found that players tend to calculate differently when they're trying to solve an online puzzle versus when they're in an actual game. And for the most part, people are able to find stuff in online tactics that they're not able to find in tournament games. And the reason for that, in my humble opinion, is that often, number one, we don't know that there's a solution in a game. So you might see something tempting, but you're not really sure if it's working, and ultimately you talk yourself out of it. And number two, even if you do spot an idea, you might notice some defense from the opponent. And again, you don't know if it's really going to work out for you or not. And because we don't have that certainty that there is a solution, we tend to not push ourselves hard enough when searching for the answer. Let's take this position as our first example. This is a game by the great Bobby Fischer. And in this position, Fischer was likely calculating the move Rook takes e6, sacrificing the exchange. So I'll ask you guys now to pause the video, calculate this one out, and try to come up with an evaluation of what happens here after best play. Okay, assuming you've paused the video and spent some time on it, we'll now continue with the solution here. Now, once again, this is a course. You know that there's going to be some kind of solution. It's a little bit easier, but I've tried to select some exercises for this video that will hopefully challenge you and really force you to push past that initial resistance. The resistance that I'm talking about, as we'll see, is when we feel like there might be some kind of counter by the opponent and we don't quite fully visualize the full solution yet. A lot of times we have to work very hard at that moment, really pushing ourselves to find the full solution, find the key idea that makes it work. So let's take a look at some variations here. Now, if black takes back on e6 after rook takes e6, let's say f takes e6, then white gets a ton of compensation for the exchange. So here, after queen takes e6, king f8, and let's say queen takes e5, the correct evaluation here is that white just has a winning position with threats of queen h8 check and starting to take all of black's pawns, as well as moves like bishop to d4 and bishop c6 followed by bishop to d5. White's initiative here is essentially crushing. Black has zero counterplay to speak of, and white is actually just going to win the game in a couple of moves. So if you calculated this far and evaluated it as winning for white, that's excellent. Giving up material is another form of resistance that is often difficult for players to handle. And hopefully seeing enough examples of players giving up material will help you kind of overcome this barrier and make you feel more comfortable with sacrificing material in a game when you're not exactly sure if, let's say, it's going to lead to checkmate and you're just playing for compensation. But in this case, hopefully it's clear now, white just has a fantastic attacking compensation and should win the game shortly. But I believe that when Fischer was calculating this, he likely noticed a second idea for black, a second defense, and that is the move queen to c8, pinning white's rook to the queen and putting white in kind of an uncomfortable spot. Now, if you miss queen c8 altogether, this of course takes some points away from the total score. It's important to anticipate all of our opponent's best defenses and try to come up with some kind of answer to them. But I imagine a lot of players did see this move and simply weren't sure what to do against it. Because at first glance, it kind of looks like white is a little bit stuck. The rook is pinned. There are no kinds of rook takes g6 tactics because black's queen is defended. And it seems like next move, black is just going to play queen takes e6, and white isn't going to have much compensation at all. Well, Fischer probably saw this one and probably realized that he does have an answer to this move. And if you haven't found it yet, I would encourage you to go back to this position and try to calculate it from here. as if you were in a real game. You see rook takes e6 as a possibility. You see queen c8 is an unfortunate defense. And here you're going to try to overcome that resistance and try to push and find the winning idea from there. So I'll give you now another chance to pause the video and really try to make it work. Okay, so let's move on with the solution. So after rook takes e6, queen to c8, white has a really strong move, bishop to d7. The point is to attract the queen to this d7 square where it would be hanging, and then that would give white the chance to play rook takes g6, winning black's queen on the spot. So after queen takes d7, for example, rook takes g6, white is winning the queen and game over. If black does not capture the bishop after bishop to d7, black has to move the queen out of the way. Then white is able to save the rook, and the bishop will be defended as well. For example, queen d8, rook to c6, and white is left with an extra piece in this position. Or maybe rook a6 is slightly more accurate to make sure the bishop is able to get out. So this is a simple example, but hopefully it illustrates the point well, in that a lot of times we might notice a defense from the opponent and give up on the line, but I would encourage you guys to try to really push yourselves and really try to make something work when you feel like it's very close to working. Our next example here is another really interesting position. It is black to play. Black is currently a full rook down, but white's king is out on g5 and quite vulnerable. But here, after white's last move, rook to f1, black has a very serious choice to make. Either opt for the rook endgame, which looks like black might be somewhat worse there, or try to go for the mate with rook to g8 check. Now, most players would probably calculate a line as follows. Rook to g8 check. The king is forced to go to h6, otherwise queen takes h2 is just immediate mate. And here, after king h6, queen takes h2, white can defend with rook to h5. At first glance, it looks like the line is over. Black has run out of checks and white is just going to be up a rook. But I want you guys to try to calculate to that point, push past that resistance, and find the win for black. Of course, it's easier knowing that there is a win there, but that's the point of this training, to give you a sense of what it might feel like to come up against that resistance and then try to overcome it with concrete calculation. As a reminder, always make sure to look at your forcing moves. With that, I'll give you a chance to pause the video now and try to figure it out for yourself. Okay, hopefully you spotted the solution. And here, the winning move after rook to g8 check, king h6, queen takes h2, rook h5 is the nice deflection tactic, queen to d2 check. Hitting white's queen with the point of after queen takes d2, black has rook to g6 with an immediate mate. Of course, white can defend against the check with rook f4, but then black simply wins white's queen and is winning the game. Not too difficult of a move to see when you know something is there. And of course, this comes back to the difficulty of trying to calculate accurately in a game. In a game, you don't actually know that you have something. But my point is this. If you're able to find this move in a puzzle setting or in a setting like this, where you're working through a course and a coach is telling you you have something there, you can kind of give yourself that push, that mental push during the game. I didn't give you guys any particular hints as to what kind of moves to look for or anything like that. Of course, I said look for forcing moves, but this is something that you should be reminding yourself over and over again anyway. And the point is, if you're able to visualize and spot the idea in a puzzle setting, you're also able to visualize it in a game setting. So the only difference there is a psychological one. Again, in a game, you don't know for sure that there's a solution, so we don't have that kind of optimism that there should be something. But strong players often develop this optimism, and they often figure it out that actually, if there is something there, maybe I can find it. And that's kind of what I want to instill in you guys watching the video, to kind of give yourself that belief that if there's something to be found, you can find it. And if you really believe this during the game, you'll start to see yourself finding a lot more tactical ideas over and over again. What happens to most players, going back to the start of the puzzle, they might see that rook g8 check, queen takes h2 has some potential, but they just can't seem to make it work. The truth is they don't really believe in it, is what I think is going on. And instead they might settle for the so-called safe route, taking the rook on f1 and going into this rook endgame. But once we get here, we see that after, let's say, rook e8 check and rook e7 check, White wins the a7 pawn, has a much more active rook, much more active king, actually would have a decisive advantage here. So it'd be very easy to lose this game going for the safe route, when in reality, one needed to just buckle down, put a little bit more effort in, and find that winning move, queen to d2, check. Our next example is a pretty impressive one that actually comes from a blitz game between two grandmasters. And here, black has boldly left the bishop on d7 hanging. Now, white probably realized that black's idea, in case of queen takes d7, is to play the move rook to d8, where it seems like white's queen is trapped. As you might expect, this is actually not the reality of the situation. White does have a way to get out and actually win the game by taking the bishop, and now leave it up to you guys to try to figure it out. White to play, and how does white win after queen takes d7, rook to d8? Pause the video now before we go through the solution. Okay, so once again, a lot of players might see this bishop hanging on d7. They notice that rook d8 traps the queen, and their calculation stops there. They get scared. It looks like black can get away with it. They kind of trust their opponent, and they move on, and they find a different move to play. But it's really important in situations like this, when you have a move that might just be winning, that you really try to make it work, because you never know when you might find that winning tactical idea. So let's see what happened in the game. After the move queen takes d7, which was played, and rook to d8, white came up with the fantastic resource c5, counterattacking the queen on b6, with the point that after rook takes d7, c takes b6, white would have an extra piece in the endgame as they just traded queens, and white was able to get away with taking the bishop on d7. The point was that if black had taken on c5, this would give white's queen a couple of escape squares. And here white could play queen takes b7 and would be completely winning once again. And in case of queen to b4, keeping an eye on the b7 pawn, white's queen barely sneaks out with queen to c7, and black unfortunately has no way of trapping this queen. Rook e7 would leave the rook on d8 hanging. Instead, if you considered the move knight to a4, this is definitely a good try. The problem with this one is that white is going to be giving back the extra piece. So after rook takes d7, knight takes b6, a takes b6, black has regained the piece and is completely fine and actually is left with an extra pawn. So it's this kind of move that's very easy to overlook. Of course, black overlooked it in the game, otherwise they wouldn't have allowed this position. And white managed to find it because white was a strong grandmaster and definitely skilled in the art of overcoming resistance, not trusting the opponent and looking for resources when you feel like there might be something there. But this is a really easy move to overlook simply for the psychological reason that we don't like getting our queen trapped. And a lot of players would simply stop calculating after queen takes d7, rook to d8, maybe look briefly for some kind of resource, but not really pushing themselves fully. This is just one move. It's definitely not the hardest move to see, but it is difficult if you don't believe a solution is there. Our next example is quite a tough one, but hopefully by this point you're kind of getting the hang of really pushing yourself and looking for those difficult resources. Here, black's queen is under attack. And at first glance, it looks like the rook on e2 is hanging. Well, here black quickly realized that if queen takes e2, white's idea is to play queen takes f6, threatening the mate on g7. The point that after g takes f6, rook to g3 check, black is getting mated. King h8, bishop takes f6 with an instant mate. After queen takes e2, queen takes f6, black doesn't have time to take the rook on d3 as g7 mate is hanging as well. But I'll tell you guys, queen takes e2 is working for black and it is a winning move in the position. So now I'd ask you to pause the video and really try to make it work. Black to play and win after queen takes e2, queen takes f6. Okay, so moving on with the solution now. After queen takes e2, queen takes f6, black is an amazing way of defending g7 and covering against all the potential checkmates, and that is with the surprising move queen to g4. Pretty much the most invisible move you can think of. Our brains are naturally trained not to hang the queen, and especially not to hang the queen to our opponent's pawns. So it wouldn't be surprising if for many players this move just didn't even exist in the position. It's kind of a no-no square for putting the queen. But once we see that it is possible, it's actually not too difficult to realize the idea and calculate it out. After queen to g4, white's queen is now hanging on f6. And of course, after h takes g4, black is able to play g takes f6 with an extra exchange and let's say some winning chances in this endgame. Of course, anything is better than simply getting mated on the spot. So a very difficult move to see. Note that the queen is also defending the g7 pawn. So if white plays something like rook to g3 here, black continues queen takes g3, g7 is still defended and will take on f6 anyway. And essentially white has nothing better than to go for this endgame with hg, gf6, where black definitely has the upper hand. So of course, a really difficult move to see, and in a game, I can imagine a lot of players, let's say, chickening out and not taking the rook, seeing that queen takes f6 is a big problem, not seeing what to do about it. I'll quickly mention that after queen takes e2, queen takes f6, if your idea was queen to d1 check, this doesn't spoil things. If rook takes d1, gf6, black is again doing well. But after king to h2 here, keeping all the threats alive in the position, here black would really need to find queen to g4 in order to save the game. And without this move, none of this is working. Instead, what a lot of players might do, not seeing this queen g4 resource, is try to play some kind of safer move like queen to d8 or queen to d6. But both of these moves would probably lead to a victory for white. Queen d6, for example, white can trade everything off and start collecting material with bishop takes f6 and rook takes d6 and so on. And on queen to d8, if nothing else, white can play rook to g3 here or queen e3, and white's attack would be extremely powerful with all the pieces looking towards black's king side. So this might at first glance look like black is holding on, but give it a couple moves and white's attack will simply be decisive. Our last example here will hopefully give you a chance to flex your visualization skill. Here it's white to play and win, and if you don't want any hints whatsoever, I'd recommend pausing the video right now and thinking for yourself. But I'd also like to give you guys the first couple of moves of the combination so that you can kind of work it out until the end. So here the winning line starts with rook takes c6. And the point of this one is that after bishop takes c6, white is going to continue queen to c4 check, forcing king b7 to defend the bishop. And then white surprisingly has a forced mate with queen takes c6 check, king takes c6, and then a winning line from there. So that's what I'll ask you guys to stop the video and really think about and try to work it out all the way until the end. It's not too difficult to notice that white has some potential there because of the discovered attack along the diagonal, but it's very easy to not really take the line seriously and kind of discard it before giving it a fair chance. But I'm telling you now that this variation is working, and so that's the exercise here. Calculate rook takes c6, bishop takes c6, queen c4 check, king b7, queen takes c6, king takes c6, and then pause and find the full win for white from there. Okay, with that, let's take a look at the solution. So after rook takes c6, bishop takes c6, queen c4 check. Now, objectively, it's probably best for black to leave the bishop hanging and play something like king a7 there, but that one is not very difficult to evaluate. White just plays queen takes c6. We'll have two minor pieces for the rook, and the bishop on the long diagonal will be a really powerful force, so that's just easy winning for white. Instead, the critical line is to understand what happens after king to b7, and if you don't find this one, it'd be very difficult to make this move in your game, because of course, white has already sacrificed the exchange to get to this point, and if there's no obvious follow-up here, then white is just going to be left down in exchange. So it's really important to kind of see this one out all the way through from the beginning. So let's see what happens. Well, queen takes e6 is a surprising move, but it turns out to lead to a direct mate by force. After king takes e6, the right way is to play knight to e5 check, covering the key escape square d7 and forcing black's king to come forward with king to c5. Now white continues with knight to d3 check, and once again the king only has one option here. All the squares are covered except for the d4 square, so black is forced to play king to d4. And this is where I think actually a lot of players might get stuck, either in a puzzle or especially in a real game where it doesn't seem to be any obvious checkmate and it feels like the king is starting to run away and, well, white only has two minor pieces left, so how could this possibly be winning? But knowing that there's a solution there gives you a bit of encouragement and gives you a lot more potential to actually find it. And this is the kind of encouragement and optimism it's really important to incorporate in your games when you're looking for that knockout blow. Because a lot of times it will be difficult to find, but it's important to believe that if there's something there, you'll be able to find it. And I think it does give you better chances in the long run. And as it turns out, white wins with the quiet move king to d2, taking away black's final escape squares and preparing the move c3 with checkmate. And unfortunately for black, with an extra queen and rook, there's no way to defend against this threat, and black is simply getting mated next move. The king can't escape or do anything. It's simply game over. So a really beautiful combination, and one that's very difficult to find in a game because it requires white to see many moves ahead. In this case, the total number of moves is 6, not including the last move, c3, checkmate. And in a game, it's very easy to convince yourself that this isn't working. You think the king is going to escape. There's too many squares that the king can go to. But ultimately, none of this is going to replace just calmly calculating the line out until its completion. And if you're able to visualize things out and you're able to keep going and push past that resistance, a lot of times you can find all kinds of fantastic ideas and resources like this one. If you struggled on this problem, that's totally reasonable. This is a pretty long solution and honestly pretty challenging. I'd encourage you, as I mentioned before, to go back to the starting position here and try to visualize the full solution for yourself, just so you can kind of feel like what it would feel like during a game to really calculate this one out and really be able to visualize all the way until the end. So hopefully you're able to visualize until that final position, king to d2, and you can recognize that black is out of escape squares and c3 checkmate is coming. That's going to wrap it up for this video, guys. I hope you found it useful. I think this kind of psychological confidence or optimism, let's call it, is really important when we're calculating sharp lines in a game and we're really trying to make some idea work. And hopefully you can put this into practice by really trying to push yourself and not stopping at that first moment of resistance. You see that black has, or you see that your opponent has some defense, but it doesn't mean that that's the end of the variation. Maybe you can keep going and finding some kind of key resource from there. With that, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take care.